Hello, welcome to Algorithms. Today we are going to discuss about part 2 of the Enterprise BI with Azure Synapse Analytics architecture. Now in this part we are going to discuss about DevOps consideration. Slide number 1, 2 and 3 is an overlap with the part 1, which is just to provide the reference and to make sure that you don't have to go through the part 1 again, so that you can refresh the concept and then look at how DevOps can be utilized for this kind of reference architecture. So as we know, that scenario is an organization has a large OLTP data set stored in a SQL Server database on premises, and the organization wants to use Azure Synapse to perform analysis using Power BI. Now we discussed about high-level architecture, about the different components and why we are using different components in part 1. We discussed about the data pipeline as well, and different recommendations for BCP, Azure Copy, Polybase, transformation from staging to production, and then implementing Azure Analysis Services semantic model. Since dimensional model is not available, it is just tabular model. So we discussed about those recommendations, and a couple of others is specific to Active Directory from the access and control perspective. Since this part is also covered, we will directly jump to the DevOps consideration, and let's have a look at the different aspects. So if you have to implement continuous integration and continuous delivery for your data pipeline, which is kind of the similar case just we presented now. So you need to make sure that you create separate resource groups for production, development, and test environments, so that separate resource groups make it easier to manage deployments and manage the access rights as well. Now, from the templates perspective, you can use Azure Building Blocks templates, or create Azure Resource Manager template, which are ARM template, to deploy to the Azure resources. If you know the infrastructure as a code process, you must be aware about how to deploy these config files using different parameters to your environment. And with the templates, automatic deployments using Azure DevOps services or CI/CD solutions is pretty easy. Now, when you put each workload in a separate deployment template and store the resources in source control systems, this helps you manage the different versions of your scripts, and you can deploy the templates together or individually as a part of CI/CD process to make the automation process smooth. Now, when we are talking about Azure workloads or different workloads, in this scenario there are three different types of workload we are talking about. One is the Azure Data Warehouse workload. The second is analysis services and its related resources. The third is Azure Data Factory workload. Now each workload has its own deployment template. On top of it, you have an on-premises to cloud integration as well that you have to keep in mind. So you can include that as a part of workload as well if you are using data sync operation using ADF. But as I said in my previous presentation, that I'm going to cover ADF in my next presentation once this DevOps is done. But in this DevOps consideration, you can think about having a data synchronization process in place as a fourth workload. Now, since each workload has its own template, the data warehouse server is set up and configured by using Azure command line interface. which follows the approach of infrastructure as a code practice. You can consider using deployment scripts and integrate them in the automation process. The other consideration regarding the staging your workloads, you can deploy to various stages and run validation checks at each stage before moving to the next stage, which is very important in order to make sure that your changes are moving in the right direction, plus the changes are accurate. That way you can push updates to your production environments in a highly controlled way and minimize the unanticipated deployment challenges. Uh, from the uh, from the deployment perspective, you can look at blue-green deployment or canary release strategies for updating live production environments. Now, this really depends upon what sort of workloads you have, how many users are accessing, how you want to do it, how you manage other applications. So this sort of depends on kind of overall framework that your organization is using. Having a rollback strategy is very important to make sure that you handle failed deployments. For example, you can automatically redeploy an earlier uh, successful deployment from your deployment history, and you can troubleshoot the errors looking at the logs. Azure Monitor is an important component from the monitoring perspective. It is recommended, but sometimes customers choose to use the existing tools that they have. Means it's not that you don't have ways of monitoring Azure Synapse Analytics, Azure Analysis Services, or database services. You have those things, but Azure Monitor is more of a consolidated. It's a one-stop shop where you get metrics from different systems. You can create one dashboard and you get everything at one place. So Azure Monitor is a recommended option for analyzing the performance of your not just data warehouse but the entire Azure Analytics platform from an integrated monitoring experience perspective. As I said, Azure and Synapse Analytics provides a monitoring experience within the Azure portal to show insights to your data warehouse workload. The Azure portal is the recommended tool when monitoring your data warehouses because it provides configurable retention periods, alerts, recommendations, and customizable charts and dashboards for metrics and logs. So these are some of the DevOps consideration that you should consider in terms of how you want to deploy, but these are just I would say starting steps, but you have to move in the similar order. First create resource group, then you look at the templates, then how you are structuring your workload, or how you are separating deployment templates, how you are looking at workloads, then you are looking at release strategy or deployment strategy, what sort of strategy you want to deploy. So you have to go through this process, but I wanted to make sure that because since this process is generally considered in software development environment, mostly users who are or companies who are using analytics, they don't look at DevOps implementation in the analytics environment, but we are looking at minimizing errors, we are looking at automation. So that's the reason I wanted to make sure that I cover this presentation as a part 2 to make sure that we are moving not just in the right direction, but we are moving in a kind of a staircase approach, so that part 1 is reference architecture, part 2 is DevOps consideration, and then we will look at the security aspects as well. But before that, I'm going to cover the presentations which I mentioned or promised in my previous discussion, which is part 1. This is it from my side. I hope you enjoy rest of your day. Thank you very much. Bye.